Section 22 of Woman in Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Woman in Science by John Augustine Zahm. Chapter 10, Part 2. We are now prepared for the consideration of the part woman has taken in this specializing movement, and for a discussion of her share in modern inventions and in the improvements of those manifold inventions which were due to her genius and industry untold ages ago. Considering the short time during which her inventive mind has been specially active, and the many handicaps which have been imposed on her, the wonder is not that she has achieved so little in comparison with man, but rather that she has accomplished so much. The first woman to receive a patent in the United States was Mary Keyes. It was issued May 5, 1809, for a process of straw weaving with silk or thread. 6 years later, Mary Brush was granted a patent for a corset. It seems to have been quite satisfactory, for no other patent of this article of feminine attire was issued to a woman until 1841, when one was granted to Elizabeth Adams. During the 32 years which elapsed between the issuing of a patent to Mary Keyes and Elizabeth Adams, but 20 other patents were granted to women. The chief of these were for weaving hats from grass, manufacturing moccasins, whitening leghorn straw, for a sheet-iron shovel, a cook-stove, and a machine for cutting straw and fodder. During the decade following 1841, 14 patents were issued to as many different women. Among the articles patented by them were an ice cream freezer, a weighing scale, and a fan attachment for a rocking chair. It was not recorded, however, that this last invention, valuable as it was apparently, ever became particularly popular. But by far the most remarkable of woman's inventions during this period was a submarine telescope and lamp, for which a patent was awarded in 1845 to Sarah Mather. From 1851 to 1861, 28 patents were issued to women, just twice the number awarded them during the preceding decade. Most of these patents were for articles of domestic use or feminine apparel. 4 of them, however, comprised a scale for instrumental music, for mounting fluid lenses, a fountain pen, and an improvement in reaping and mowing machines. The following decade is remarkable for the wonderful increase in the number of inventions due to women, for there was a sudden jump from 28 to 441 patents awarded them between the years 1861 and 1871. Women now began to have confidence in their inventive faculties, and, no longer content with exercising their genius on articles of clothing and culinary utensils, sewing, washing, and churning machines, they began to devote their attention to objects that were entirely foreign to their ordinary home activities. This is clearly evinced by the patents they obtained for such inventions as improvements in locomotive wheels, devices for reducing straw and other fibrous substances for the manufacture of paper pulp, improvements in corn huskers, low water indicators, steam and other whistles, corn plows, a method of constructing screw propellers, improvements in materials for packing journals and bearings, in fire alarms, thermometers, railroad car heaters, improvements in lubricating railway journals, in conveyors of smoke and cinders for locomotives, in pyrotechnic night signals, burglar alarms, railway car safety apparatus, in apparatus for punching corrugated metals, desulfurizing ores and other similar inventions in the domain of mechanical engineering, inventions that, at first blush, would seem to be quite alien to the genius and capacity of woman. From now on, women's inventions in the United States increased at an extraordinary rate, for from 1871 until July 1st, 1888, when the first government report was made on the patents issued to women inventors, she had to her credit nearly 2,000 inventions, many of which were of prime importance. During the 7 years following 1888, she was awarded 2,526 patents, more than the total number that had been granted her during the preceding 79 years. Between 1895 and 1910, 3,615 more patents were placed to her credit, making a grand total for her first century of inventive achievement of 8,596 patents. No Patent Office reports are available since 1910, but the number of inventions for which women have received patents since Mary Keyes was awarded hers on May 5, 1809, for straw weaving with silk or thread, cannot be far from 10,000. This fact will, doubtless, be a revelation to that large class of men who still seem to share the views of Voltaire and Proudhon that women are incapable of inventing even the simplest article of domestic use. The following story well illustrates the prevailing ignorance regarding the part women have taken in the invention of certain articles that are so common that most people think they were never patented. I was out driving once with an old farmer in Vermont, writes Mrs. Ada C. Bowles, and he told me, "You women may talk about your rights, but why don't you invent something?" I answered, "Your horse's feed bag and the shade over his head were both of them invented by women." The old fellow was so taken aback that he was barely able to gasp, "Do tell." Had he investigated further, he would have found that the fly net on the horse's back, the tugs and other harness trimmings, the shoes on his horse's feet, and the buggy seat he then occupied were all the inventions of women. Footnote: to one woman, Mary E. Poupard of London, England, were granted in a single year no less than 3 patents for horseshoes, 2 of the patents being for sectional and segmental horseshoes. End footnote. He would doubtless also have discovered that the currycomb he had used before starting out on his drive, as well as the snap hook of the halter and the check rein, and the stall unhitching device, were likewise the inventions of members of that sex whose capacity he was so disposed to depreciate. For women have been awarded patents, in some instances several of them, for all the articles that have been mentioned. He might furthermore have learned that the fellies in his buggy wheels and his daughter's side saddle had been made under women's patents, and that, to complete his surprise and confusion, the leather used in his harness had been sewn by a machine patented by a woman who was not only an inventor, but who was also, for many years, the manager and proprietor of a large harness factory in New York City. What particularly arrests one's attention in reading the Patent Office reports is not only the large number of inventions by women, but also the very wide range of the devices which they embrace. It is not surprising to find them inventing and improving culinary utensils, house furniture and furnishings, toilet articles, wearing apparel and stationery, trunks and bags, toys and games, designs for printed and textile fabrics, for boxes and baskets, screens, awnings, baby carriers, musical instruments, appliances for washing and cleaning, attachments for bicycles and typewriting machines, art, educational and medical appliances, for these things are in keeping with their proper métier. But it is surprising for those who are not familiar with the history of modern inventions to learn of the share women have had in inventing and improving agricultural implements, building appurtenances, motors of various kinds, plumbing apparatus, theatrical stage mechanisms, and, above all, countless railway appliances, from a coupling or fender to an apparatus for sanding railroad tracks, or a device for unloading box-cars. Those who are still of the opinion of Voltaire and Proudhon, and their name is legion, respecting woman's inventive powers, might be willing to accord her the capacity to design a new form of clothespin, or hair crimper, or rouge pad, or complexion mask, or powder puff, or baby jumper, but they would limit her ability to contrivances of this character. But what would these same people say if they were told that, over and above the things just mentioned for which many women have actually received patents, The much depreciated female sex had been granted patents for locomotive wheels, stuffing boxes, railway car safety apparatus, life rafts, cut-offs for hydraulic and other engines, street cars, mining machines, furnaces for smelting ores, sound-deadening attachments for railway cars, feed pumps and transfer apparatus for traction cars, machines for driving hoops onto barrels, apparatus for destroying vegetation on and removing snow from railroads, coke crushers, artificial stone compositions, elevated railways, new forms of cattle cars, dams and reservoirs, welding seams of pipes and hardening iron, alloys for bell metal and alloys to resemble silver, methods of refining and hardening copper, processes for concentrating ores, improvement in elevators, and designs for raising sunken vessels. And yet, incredible as it may appear to these scoffers at woman's genius, patents for all these inventions, methods, and processes, many of them of exceeding value, and for hundreds of others of a similar nature, have been issued to women during recent years. And the activity of the fair inventors, far from abating, is becoming daily more pronounced, and promises to reward their efforts with far greater triumphs. Indeed, women are becoming so active in the numerous fields of invention, even in such unlikely ones as metallurgy and civil, mechanical, and electrical engineering, that they bid fair to rival men in what they have long regarded as their peculiar specialty. In 1892, a woman in New York was granted 2 patents, one for a process of malting beer and the other for hooping malt liquors. These inventions, however, are not so foreign to the avocation of woman as they at first appear. For if we may believe the teachings of ethnology and prehistoric archaeology in this matter, women were the first brewers. The one, therefore, who 2 decades ago secured the 2 patents just mentioned, was but taking up anew an occupation in which her sex furnished the first invention many thousand years ago. An instructive fact touching woman's inventive achievements is that her fullest success is coincident with her enlarged opportunities for education, and began with the breaking down of the prejudices which so long existed against her having anything to do with the development of the mechanical or industrial arts. When one recollects that the public schools of Boston, established in 1642, were not open to girls until a century and a half later, and then only for the most elementary branches, and for but 1/2 the year, and that girls did not have the benefit of a high school education in the center of New England culture until 1852, and when one furthermore recalls the attitude of the general public toward women and girls extending their activities beyond the nursery and the kitchen, it is easy to understand that there was not much encouragement for them to exercise their inventive talent, even if they had felt an inclination to do so. The experience of Miss Margaret Knight of Boston, who in 1871 was awarded a valuable patent for making a paper bag machine, is a case in point, and well illustrates some of the difficulties that women inventors had to contend with only a few decades ago. As a child, she writes to a friend, I never cared for the things that girls usually do. Dolls never had any charms for me. I couldn't see the sense of coddling bits of porcelain with senseless faces. The only things I wanted were a jackknife, a gimlet, and pieces of wood. My friends were horrified. I was called a tomboy, but that made very little impression on me. I sighed sometimes because I was not like other girls, but wisely concluded that I couldn't help it, and sought further consolation from my tools. I was always making things for my brothers. Did they want anything in the line of playthings, they always said, Mattie will make them for us. I was famous for my kites, and my sleds were the envy and admiration of all the boys in town. I'm not surprised at what I've done. I'm only sorry I couldn't have had as good a chance as a boy, and have put to my trade regularly. Even after she had demonstrated her skill as an inventor, Miss Knight had to encounter the skepticism of the workmen to whom she entrusted the manufacture of her machines. They questioned her ability to superintend her own work, and it was only her persistency and remarkable competency that ultimately converted their incredulity into respect and admiration. Since women have come into the possession of greater freedom than they formerly enjoyed, and have been afforded better opportunities of developing their inventive faculties, many of them have taken to invention as an occupation, and with marked success. They find it the easiest and most congenial way of earning a livelihood, and not a few of them have been able thereby to accumulate comfortable fortunes, besides developing industries that have given employment to thousands of both sexes. Thus, the straw industry in the United States is due to Miss Betsy Metcalf, who, more than a century ago, produced the first straw bonnet ever manufactured in this country. Since then, the industry which this woman originated has assumed immense proportions. The number of straw hats now made in Massachusetts alone, not to speak of those annually manufactured elsewhere, runs into the millions. Scarcely less wonderful is the industry developed by Miss Knight, already mentioned, through her marvelous invention for manufacturing satchel-bottom paper bags. Many men had previously essayed to solve the problem which she attacked with such signal success, but all to no purpose. So valuable was her invention considered by experts that she refused $50,000 for it shortly after taking out her patent. Often what are apparently the most trivial inventions prove the most lucrative. Thus, a Chicago woman receives a handsome income for her invention of a paper pail. A woman in San Francisco invented a baby carriage and received $14,000 for her patent. The gimlet-pointed screw, which was the idea of a little girl, has realized to its patentee an independent fortune. Still more remarkable is the Burden horseshoe machine, the invention of a woman, which turns out a complete horseshoe every 3 seconds, and which is said to have effected a saving to the public of tens of millions of dollars. The cotton gin, one of the most useful and important of American inventions, a machine that effected a complete revolution in the cotton industry throughout the world, is due to a woman, Catherine L. Greene, the wife of General Nathaniel Greene, of Revolutionary fame. After she had fully developed in her own mind a method for separating the cotton from its seed, which was after her husband's death, she entrusted the making of the machine to Eli Whitney, who was then boarding with her, and who had a Yankee's skill in the use of tools. Whitney was several times on the point of abandoning as impossible the task which had been assigned to him, but Mrs. Greene's faith in ultimate success never wavered, and thanks to her persistence in the work and the putting into execution of her ideas, her great undertaking was finally crowned with success. She did not apply for a patent for her invention in her own name, because so opposed was public opinion to woman's having part in mechanical occupation that she would have exposed herself to general ridicule and to a loss of position in society. The consequence was that Whitney, her employee, got credit for an invention which in reality belonged to her. She was, however, subsequently able to retain a subordinate interest in it through her second husband, Mr. Miller. This is only one of many instances in which patents taken out in the name of some man are really due to women. The earliest development of the mower and reaper, as well as the clover cleaner, belongs to Mrs. A. H. Manning of Plainfield, New Jersey. The patent on the clover cleaner was issued in the name of her husband, but as he failed to apply for a patent for the mower and reaper, his wife was, after his death, robbed of the fruit of her brain by a neighbor, whose name appears on the list of patentees of an invention which originated with Mrs. Manning. A few years ago, men of science awoke to the startling fact that the Earth's supply of nitrates was being rapidly exhausted. It was then realized that, unless some new store of this essential fertilizer could be found, it would soon be impossible to provide the food requisite for the world's teeming millions. What was to be done? Never was a more important problem presented to science for solution, and never did science more quickly and efficaciously respond. It was soon recognized that the Earth's atmosphere was the only available storehouse for the much-needed nitrogen. Forthwith, scientists and inventors the world over proceeded to tap this source of supply and to convert its vast stores of nitrogen into the nitrates, which are so indispensable to vegetable life. To form some idea of the importance of the problem and the urgency of its solution, it may be stated that the amount of fertilizer required for the cotton crop alone in the southern states in 1911 was no less than 3 million tons. What, then, must have been the total amount used through the world for cereals and other crops that need constant fertilizing? The famous nitrate deposits of Chile could supply only a small fraction of the stupendous amount required, and they, according to recent calculations, cannot continue to meet the present demands on them for more than 100 years longer at most. The process involved, when once conceived, was simple enough, for it merely required the conversion of the nitrogen of the air into nitric acid, which in turn was employed in the production of nitrate of lime. But simple as it was, mankind had to wait a long time for its origination, and action was taken only when necessity compelled. At present there are numerous nitrate factories in France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Norway, and the United States, and the output is already enormous and constantly increasing. Electricity, that mysterious force which has so frequently come to man's assistance during the last few decades, is the agent employed. But who was the originator of the idea of utilizing the atmosphere for the production of nitrates? Who took out the first patent for a process for making nitrates by using the nitrogen of the air? It was a Frenchwoman, Madame Lefebvre of Paris, long since forgotten. As early as 1859 she obtained a patent in England for her invention, but as the need of fertilizers was not so urgent then as it is now, it was allowed to drop into oblivion, and the matter was not again taken up until a half-century later, when others secured the credit for an idea which was first conceived by a woman who happened to have the misfortune to live 50 years in advance of her time. It were easy to extend the list of important inventions due to women and of patents which were issued in the name of their husbands or other men. To tell of inventions, too, of whose fruits, because they happened to be helpless or inexperienced women, the real patentees were often robbed. But the foregoing instances are quite sufficient to show what woman's keen inventive genius is capable of achieving, in spite of all the restrictions put on her sex, and in spite of her lack of training in the mechanical arts. Had women, since the organization of our Patent Office, enjoyed all the educational opportunities possessed by men, had they received the same encouragement as the lordly sex to develop their inventive faculties, had the laws of the country accorded them the rewards to which their labor and genius entitled them, they would now have far more inventions to their credit than those indicated in our government reports, and they would furthermore be able to point to far more brilliant achievements than have heretofore, under the unfavorable conditions under which they were obliged to work, been possible. But when we recall all the obstacles they have had to overcome, and remember also the fact that most of the patents referred to in the preceding pages have been secured by women living in the United States, little being said of the modern inventions of women in foreign countries, we can see that their record is indeed a splendid one, that their achievements are not only worthy of all praise, but also a happy augury for the future. When they shall have the same freedom of action as men in all departments of activity in which they exhibit special aptitude, when they shall have the same advantages of training and equipment and the prospect of the same emoluments as the sterner sex for the products of their brainwork and craftsmanship, then may we expect them to achieve the same distinction in the mechanic arts as has rewarded their efforts in science and literature. And then, too, may we hope to see them once more regain something of that supremacy in invention which was theirs in the early history of our race. End of Chapter 10. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, in March 2011 in San Diego, California.
Section 23 of Woman in Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Woman in Science by John Augustine Zahm. Chapter 11, Part 1. Women as Inspirers and Collaborators in Science. One of the most interesting literary figures of the 5th century was Caius Apollinaris Sidonius, who, after holding a number of important civil offices, became the Bishop of Clermont. The most valuable of his extant works are his 9 books of letters, which are a mine of information respecting the history of his age and the manners, customs, and ideals of his contemporaries. In one of these letters, addressed to Hesperius, a young friend of his who exhibited special talent in polite literature, he expresses a sentiment which applies as well to the votary of science as to the man of letters. Referring to the assistance which women had given to their husbands and friends in their studies, he conjures him to remember that in days of old it was the wont of Martia, Terentia, Calpurnia, Pudentilla, and Rusticana to hold the lamp, while their husbands Hortensius, Cicero, Pliny, Apuleius, and Symmachus were reading and meditating. This picture of women as light-bearers to the great orators and philosophers just named is symbolic of them as the helpmates and inspirers of men in every field of human activity and in every age of the world's history. Always and everywhere, when permitted to occupy the same social plane as men, women have been not only as lamps unto the feet and light unto the paths of their male compeers in the ordinary affairs of life, but have also been their guiding stars and ministering angels in the highest spheres of intellectual effort. For nearly 18 centuries, St. Jerome has had the gratitude of the Church for his masterly translation, known as the Vulgate, of the Hebrew Scriptures. But, had it not been for his 2 noble friends, Paula and Eustochium, who were as eminent for their intellectual attainments as they were for their descent from the most distinguished families of Rome and Greece, there would have been no Vulgate. For they were not only his inspirers in this colossal undertaking, but they were his active and zealous collaborators as well. Dante and Petrarch are acclaimed as the morning stars of modern literature, but both of them owed their immortality to the inspiration of 2 pure-minded and noble-hearted women. In the concluding paragraph of his Vita Nuova, the most beautiful love story ever written, Dante records his purpose to say of his inspirer, the gentle, gracious Beatrice Portinari, what was never said of any woman. The outcome of this exalted purpose was the Divina Commedia, the world's greatest literary masterpiece. Petrarch, the father of humanism, is the first to give Laura de Noves credit for his attainments as a poet. In one of his poems he sings, "Blessed be the year, the month, the hour, the day, the season and the time and point of space, and blessed the beauteous country and the place, where first of 2 eyes I felt the sway." Elsewhere, in one of his prose dialogues with St. Augustine, he declares, "Whatever you see in me, be it little or much, is due to her. Nor would I ever have attained to this measure of name and fame unless she had cherished by those most noble influences that my feeble implanting of virtues which nature had placed in this breast." A no less remarkable inspirer, but in an entirely different sphere of activity, was a devout and spotless Italian maiden, Chiara Schiffi, better known as St. Clara. She was, as is well known, the ardent co-operator of St. Francis Assisi in his great work of social and religious reform, which has contributed so much towards the welfare of humanity. But it is not generally known what an important part she had in this great undertaking, and how she sustained the poverello during the long hours of trial and hardship. It was during these periods of care and struggle that we see how courageous and intrepid was this woman who has always been represented as frail, emaciated, blanched like a flower of the cloister. She defended Francis not only against others, but also against himself. In those dark hours of discouragement which so often and so profoundly disturb the noblest souls and sterilize the grandest efforts, she was beside him to show the way. When he doubted his mission and thought of fleeing to the heights of repose and solitary prayer, it was she who showed him the ripening harvest with no reapers to gather it in, men going astray with no shepherd to herd them, and drew him once again into the train of the Galilean, into the number of those who give their lives as a ransom for many. It is under the shade of the olive trees of St. Damien, with his sister friend Clara caring for him, that he composes his finest work, that which Ernest Renan called the most perfect utterance of modern religious sentiment, the Canticle of the Sun. This canticle, however, beautiful as it is, lacks, as has well been remarked, one strophe. If it was not upon Francis's lips, it was surely in his heart. Be praised, Lord, for Sister Clara. Thou hast made her silent, active, and sagacious, and by her thy light shines in our hearts. It was through the inspiration and influence of Theodora that the famous Church of St. Sophia, that matchless poem in marble and gold, that imperishable monument to the glory of the true God, came into existence. It was through her that Justinian conceived the idea of those pandects and institutes which constitute the greatest glory of his reign, and which are the basis of the Code Napoleon and of all modern jurisprudence. It was to the Vittoria Colonna that Michelangelo dedicated many of the most exquisite productions of his peerless genius. He saw, as has been said, with her eyes and acted by her inspiration. Almost every one of Chopin's compositions was inspired by women, and a large proportion of them are dedicated to them. The same may be said of Mozart, Mendelssohn, Schubert, Beethoven, Weber, Schumann, and other illustrious composers. All of these sons of genius believed with Castiglione that all inspiration must come from woman, that she had been expressly created and sent into the world to inspire them with intelligence and creative power. Monsieur Clavier declares that there is hardly a philosopher or a poet of the 16th century whose pages are not illuminated or gladdened by the smile of some high-born lady. What the brilliant Frenchman says of the influence of women on the poets and philosophers of a single century could with equal truth be said of the poets and philosophers of every century, from Anacreon and Plato to the present day. And still more, it can be predicated of women's inspiration and influence in every department of intellectual effort, in art and architecture, in music and literature, in science in all its departments, whether deductive or inductive. It has been well said, were history to be rewritten, with due regard to women's share in it, many small causes, heretofore disregarded, would be found fully to explain great and unlooked-for results. For it is not in outward facts, nor in great names, nor noisy deeds, nor genealogies of crowned heads, nor in tragic loves, nor ambitious or striking heroism, nor crime, that we find proofs of the constant and secret working whereby woman most effectually asserts herself. Certainly she has played her part in the outward and visible history of the world, but in that history which is told and written, which is buried in archives and revivified in books, woman's part is always small, when set beside that of her companion man. She contributes but little, and at this she may surely rejoice, to the tales of battles and treaties of successions and alliances, of fraud, violence, suspicions, and hatreds. But if the inward history of human affairs could be described as fully as the outward facts, if the story of the family could be told together with the story of the nation, if human thoughts could with certainty be divined from human deeds, then the chief figure in this history of sentiment and morals would certainly be that of woman the inspirer. This same statement would hold equally good if applied to the part taken by women in the history of science. Their achievements have, in most cases, been so overshadowed by those of men that their work has been usually regarded of negligible quantity. But when one considers the mainsprings of actions, and examines the silent undercurrents which escape the notice of the superficial observer, one finds, as in social and political history, that the most important scientific investigations are often conducted, and the most momentous discoveries are made, in consequence of the promptings of some devoted woman friend, or in virtue of the still, small voice of a cherished wife or sister, who prefers to remain in the background in order that all the glory of achievement may redound to the man. There have been, it may safely be asserted, few really eminent men in science, as there have been few really eminent men in art or letters, or in the great reform and religious movements of the world, who have not been assisted by some woman light-bearer, as were Hortensius by Martia, Tully by Terentia, and Pliny by Calpurnia. There have been few that have not, during hours of doubt and discouragement, been sustained and stimulated, as was Francis by Clara, Jerome by Paula, and Eustochium. And there have been still fewer who have not had, like Petrarch and Dante, their Laura or their Beatrice, of whom each could say, "This is the beacon guides to deeds of worth, and urges me to see the glorious goal. This bids me leave behind the vulgar throng." In the preceding chapters, we have had notable examples of women whose beneficent influence and cooperation have enabled distinguished men of science to achieve results that would otherwise have been impossible. Among these, to mention only a few, were Madame Lavoisier, Madame Curie in chemistry, Madame Laputte and Miss Herschel in astronomy, Mrs. Agassiz and Madame Coudreau in national science and exploration, Madame Schliemann and Madame Dieulafoy in archaeology. One of the most illustrious women inspirers of France was Catherine de Parthenay, who, after attaining womanhood, became the brilliant Princess de Rohan, and was recognized as one of the most learned and most remarkable women of the 16th century. As a young girl she exhibited rare intelligence and displayed a special aptitude for the exact sciences. For this reason her mother saw to it that her child had the benefit of instruction under the ablest masters that could be secured. The most noticed of these was François Viète, the learned French mathematician, who is justly regarded as the father of modern algebra. In his day, especially in the higher classes of society, the education given to women was often more thorough than that afforded to men. For this reason, too, women not infrequently became distinguished in astronomy, which was then usually known under the name of astrology. Viète, in initiating his gifted pupil into the principles of this science, became himself so enthusiastic a student of astronomy that he determined to prepare an elaborate work on the subject, something on the plan of the Almagest of Ptolemy, a work which he designated Harmonicum Celeste. In order that the instruction given his pupil might not be lacking in precision, Viète wrote out with the most scrupulous care the lessons designed for her benefit. The manuscripts containing these lessons were long preserved among the family archives, but nearly all of them were unfortunately consigned to the flames during the French Revolution in 1793. No one was more interested in Viète's mathematical researches, those researches which have rendered him so famous in the history of science, than was the Princess de Rohan. The former pupil was the first to receive notice of her distinguished master's discoveries, and the first to congratulate him on his success. It was to this cherished pupil, who always remained his friend and benefactress, that Viète dedicated his important work on mathematical analysis, entitled In Artem Analyticum Isagoge. The words of dedication are a tribute to the learning and the genius of the pupil, as well as the expression of gratitude of the teacher. It reads as follows. It is to you especially, august daughter of Melusine, that I am indebted for my proficiency in mathematics, to attain which I was encouraged by your love of this science, as well as your great knowledge of it, and by your mastery of all other sciences, which one cannot too much admire in a person of your noble lineage. More interesting, and at the same time more pathetic, were the relations of an Italian nun, Sister Maria Celeste, and the man whom Byron so happily designates as the starry Galileo with his woes. Sister Celeste, who was a Franciscan nun in the convent of St. Matthew, in Arcetri, was the great astronomer's eldest and favourite daughter. They were greatly attached to each other, and the gentle Religious was not only her father's confidant and consoler in the hours of trial and affliction, but was also his inspirer and ever-vigilant guardian angel. She watched over him not as a daughter over a father, but as a mother watches over her only son. All this is beautifully exhibited in her 124 letters, which were published in 1891 for the first time. A few of these letters, it is true, were published as early as 1852 by Alberi in his edition of the Complete Works of Galileo, and others were given to the press at subsequent dates, but the world had to wait more than 2.5 centuries for a complete collection of all the known letters of this remarkable daughter of an illustrious sire. These documents are precious for the insight they give into the sterling character of a noble woman, but they are beyond price as sources of information respecting the tenderly affectionate relations which existed between her and one of the foremost men of science, not only of his own age, but of all time. They show how he made her his confidant in all his undertakings, and how she was his amanuensis, his counsellor, his inspirer, how her love was an incentive to the work that won for him undying fame, how she was his support and comfort when suffering from the jealousy of rivals or the enmity of those who were opposed to his teachings. Those letters cover a period of nearly 11 years, the most momentous years of her father's busy and troubled life. Now playful, quaint, elfish, then serious, vivid, and confidential, they show that the writer's intelligence was as rare as her nature was loyal and affectionate. At times she half apologizes for the length of a letter. But you must remember, she adds in excuse, that I must put into this paper everything that I should chatter to you in a week. No daughter was ever prouder of her father, or loved him with a more abounding love. I pride myself, she says, that I love and revere my dearest father more by far than others love their fathers, and I clearly perceive that in return he far surpasses the greater part of other fathers in the love which he has for me, his loved daughter. When he was ill, she prepared dishes and confections that she knew would tempt his appetite. But she was not satisfied with looking after the welfare of his body, for she took occasion to send with the cakes and preserved fruits a sermonette for the benefit of his soul. An extract from one of her letters gives an insight into the character of this devoted daughter, who, Galileo says in a letter to his friend Elia Dodati, was a woman of exquisite mind, singular goodness, and most tenderly attached to me. Of the preserved citron you ordered, she writes him on the 19th of December, 1625, I have only been able to do a small quantity. I feared the citrons were too shrivelled for preserving, and so they proved. I send 2 baked pears for these days of vigil. But in the greatest treat of all, I send you a rose, which ought to please you extremely, seeing what a rarity it is at this season. And with the rose you must accept its thorns. which represent the bitter passion of our Lord, while the green leaves represent the hope we may entertain through the same sacred passion, we, having passed through the darkness of this short winter of our mortal life, may attain to the brightness and felicity of an eternal spring in heaven, which may our gracious God grant us through his mercy. She always insists upon his keeping her fully informed about his studies and discoveries. She is particular also about receiving without delay copies of his latest publications. "I beg you," she writes in one of her letters, "to be so kind as to send me that book of yours which has just been published, Il Saggiatore, so that I may read it, for I have a great desire to see it." On another occasion, after his difficulties with the Holy Office, when she fancies her father is not keeping her fully informed about the subject matter of his writings, she implores him to tell her on what topic he is engaged. "If," she archly adds, "it be something I can understand, and you are not afraid that I will blab." And on still another occasion, Sister Celeste reminds her father of a promise of his to send her a small telescope. From this we should infer that she desired to repeat the observations on the heavenly bodies that had created such a sensation in the learned world, and which had given occasion for such acrimonious controversy. In one of her earlier letters, Sister Celeste called her father's attention to a promise of his to spend an afternoon with her and her sister Archangela, also a nun in the same convent. And referring to one of the regulations of the Franciscan cloister, she playfully observes, "You will be able to sup in the parlour, since the excommunication is for the tablecloth, O Sister Celeste, and not for the meats thereon." What would one not give for a stenographic report of the conversations held that afternoon in that convent garden of Arcetri, as father and daughters leisurely strolled through the peaceful enclosure, all quite oblivious of the fleeting hours? How interesting would be a faithful record of the confidences exchanged at the frugal meal in the evening in the humble parlour of St. Matteo. We would willingly exchange many of the famous Dialoghi di Galileo Galilei for a verbatim report of what passed between Sister Celeste and the father whom she so idolized. An English writer, when discussing this subject, pertinently observes, "For after all, is it not the personal incidents and commonplaces of life that gather interest as the centuries roll on, while its more pretentious events often drop into mere literary lumber? How much more interesting Dr. Johnson's incidental admission, 'I have a strong inclination, sir, to do nothing today,' is to us now than many of his more formal utterances. And in reality, is it the personal element alone that is in the long run perennial? The wise may prate as they will about the importance of maintaining the continuity of history and of handing on the torch of science. The world cares for none of these things. They interest only some few political economists and laborious men. What does the crowd and poor little Tom Jones and his nestful, for instance, care about the fact that Cheops was, at any rate by courteous tradition, a mighty man of valour of such an era and land? But little Tom Jones and the rest of us would become mightily interested in this misty monster of many traditions, could we learn in some magical way all he thought, hated, and loved in his innermost heart of hearts." Judging from her letters, she had many questions to ask him about his studies, his experiments, his discoveries, his books, as well as about more personal and domestic matters. Although there is no documentary proof of the fact, yet there is every reason to believe that Galileo had taken personal charge of the education of this, his favourite daughter. She shared his taste for science and inherited not a little of his genius. Such being the case, we may well believe that a faithful account of their conversations of that day would not only be of surpassing interest, but would also throw a flood of light on many questions now ill understood. They would certainly tend to fill up the numerous lacunae caused by the disappearance of the letters of Galileo, which he wrote in answer to those of his ever-cherished daughter. The Duke of Peresque, in a letter to Gassendi regarding Galileo, refers to certain letters of the great philosopher. This shows that Sister Celeste was kept fully informed of her father by respecting the nature and contents of his various works while he was preparing them for the press. It implies, likewise, that she was not only interested in them in a general way, but that she was able to read them intelligently and appreciate them as well. They would also show more clearly than any facts now available what an unbounded influence the gentle nun had over the greatest intellect of his time, and would, more clearly than anything else in her correspondence, exhibit Sister Celeste as the efficient co-worker and the abiding inspirer of the father of modern physics and astronomy. But although we have no record of this sole communion between father and daughter on the occasion in question, although we are deprived of the invaluable letters which he wrote in reply to hers, we are nevertheless, from the evidence at hand, justified in regarding this unique pair as being ever one in heart, aspiration, and ideals, and comparable in their mutual influence on each other with any of those famous men and women who, through achievement on the one side and inspiration and collaboration on the other, have ever been recognized as the greatest benefactors of their race. One of Galileo's countrymen, Clemente de Nelli, was right when he declared that had it not been for the assistance and consolation which he received from Sister Celeste, Galileo would have succumbed to the blows that were showered upon him during the most trying part of his career. An indication of this is given in one of the letters written by Sister Celeste in the last year of her life. When in a fit of despondency and imagining his friends had forgotten him, Galileo, in a moment of bitterness, wrote in a letter to his daughter, "My name is erased from the book of the living." "Nay," came at once Sister Celeste's cheering reply, "say not that your name is struck de libro viventium, for it is not so, neither in the greater part of the world nor in your own country. Indeed, it seems to me that if for a brief moment your name and fame were clouded, they are now restored to greater brightness, at which I am much astonished, for I know that generally nemo propheta acceptus est in patria sua." A prophet is not accepted in his own country. I am afraid, however, if I begin quoting Latin, I shall fall into some barbarism. But of a truth, you are loved and esteemed here more than ever. How much Sister Celeste was to her father in every way was not known until her premature death in her 34th year. He was never the same man afterward. Disconsolate and broken, he fancied he had heard the voice of the daughter he so fondly loved resounding through the house. Brooding over his great loss, the heartbroken old man writes to a friend in words of infinite pathos, "I continually hear myself called by my dearly beloved daughter." The 8th of January 1642 who answered her call and went to join her in a better world. Two other noted investigators, one of them a contemporary of Galileo, owed much to the inspiration and encouragement which they received from women. These were Descartes and Leibniz. And the women that had the most influence on them were representatives of royal families, who were famous in their day for their love and knowledge and the extent of their intellectual attainments. One of the most noted of these was Elizabeth of Bohemia, Princess Palatine. She was the favourite pupil of Descartes, and it was to her that he dedicated his great work, Principia Philosophae. She, he declared, understood him better than anyone else he had ever met, for in her alone were united those generally separated talents for metaphysics and for mathematics, which are so characteristically operative in the Cartesian system. To this earnest student, who was always absorbed in the mysteries of metaphysics and the problems of geometry, Descartes could refuse nothing. When distance separated them, he continued his instructions by correspondence. One of the results of this correspondence was his treatise on Passions de l'Âme, in which he developed certain ethical views suggested by the Vita Beata of Seneca. Another distinguished pupil of Descartes who exercised a marked influence over him was the celebrated daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, Queen Christine of Sweden. A mistress of many languages and an ardent votary of science, she was a munificent patron of scientific men, a great number of whom she attracted to her court. The most distinguished of these was Descartes, to whom she was deeply attached, and with whom she planned great things for science in Sweden, when his career was cut short by a premature death. Not the least influence on the intellectual life of Leibniz was Sophia Charlotte, Queen of Prussia, and the mother of Frederick the Great. She was the niece of Descartes' illustrious friend Elizabeth of Bohemia, and as the pupil of Leibniz, quite as gloriously associated as had been her aunt with the father of Cartesianism. Leibniz was as distinguished by genius as his royal pupil was by birth. Besides being eminent as a philosopher and a statesman, he shared with Newton the honour of discovering the calculus. Huxley pronounced him a man of science in the modern sense of the first rank, while the King of Prussia declared him, "He represents in himself a whole academy." Through the cooperation of Sophia Charlotte, he founded the Berlin Academy of Sciences. For her he wrote one of the most notable of his productions, his famed Theodicy. It would be difficult to estimate the influence of this learned queen on Leibniz, but it was undoubtedly greater than any other influence whatever. Her death was the greatest loss he ever suffered, and when she was no more, the beautiful Berlin suburb, Charlottenburg, named after her, where he had been so happy in reading and philosophizing with his illustrious pupil, lost all attraction for him. A more striking illustration of woman's helpfulness is afforded in the case of François Huber, the celebrated Swiss naturalist. Although blind from his 17th year, he was able to carry on researches requiring the keenest eyesight and the closest observation. This he was able to do through the affectionate cooperation of his devoted wife, Marie Aimée. When her friends tried to dissuade her from marrying Huber, to whom she had been engaged for some time, saying that he had become blind, her reply was worthy of her generous and noble nature. "He needs me now more than ever." During the 40 years of their married life, her tenderness and devotion to her husband were as unfailing as they were inspiring. He worked through the eyes and hands of his wife as if they were his own. She was his reader, his observer, his secretary, his enthusiastic collaborator in all those investigations that had rendered him so famous. The blind man devised experiments to be made, and the quick-witted wife executed them and recorded the observations which supplied the material for his epoch-making work on bees, entitled New Observations on Bees. So accurate are his descriptions of the habits of the winged creatures, to the study of which he devoted the best years of his life, that one would think his great work was the production not of a man who had been blind for a quarter of a century when he wrote it, but of one who was gifted with exceptional keenness of vision and powers of observation. "As long as she lived," exclaimed the great naturalist after his trusty Aimé's death, "I was not sensible of the misfortune of being blind. Nay more, during her lifetime when, though sightless, he was always so happy in his work, he went so far as to aver that he would be miserable were he to recover his eyesight. I should not know," he declared, "to what an extent a person in my condition should be beloved. Besides, to me my wife is always young, fresh, and pretty, which is no light matter." He could truly say of her, as Wordsworth said of his sister Dorothy, "She gave me eyes, she gave me ears, and love and thought and joy." End of chapter 11, part 1. Section 24 of Woman in Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. Woman in Science by John Augustine Zahm. Chapter 11, Part 2. We hear much of the achievements of Galvani and Faraday in the domain of electricity and electromagnetism, but little is said of the women to whom they were so greatly indebted for their success and fame. It was Galvani's wife who first directed his attention to the convulsions of a frog's leg when placed near an electrical machine. This induced him to make those celebrated investigations which led to the foundation of a new science which has ever since been identified with his name. It was Mrs. Marseille's work on science, especially her Conversations on Chemistry, that inspired Faraday with a love of science and blazed for him that road in chemical and physical experimentation which led to such marvellous results. He was always proud to call her his first teacher, and never hesitated to attribute to her that taste for scientific research for which he became so preeminent. And it was his devoted wife, who was not only a helpmate, but a soulmate as well for nearly half a century, that had very much to do with the splendid development of the germ which had been placed in his youthful mind by Mrs. Marseille. The same may likewise be asserted of the wives of two distinguished geologists, Charles Lyell and Xavier Homonaire de Hell. Mrs. Lyell was intimately associated with her husband in all of his scientific undertakings, and her ready intellect contributed immensely towards securing for him that enviable position which he attained of being the premier geologist of his century. Madame Homonaire de Hell deserves special mention in the history of geology for the invaluable assistance which she gave her husband in the scientific exploration of the basin of the Caspian Sea. Not only did she share his labours and perils in this then wild part of the world, and collaborate with him in the preparation of the report for which the French government conferred on him the Cross of the Legion of Honour, but she also wrote unaided the two descriptive volumes of their great work, Steppes de la Mer Caspienne. Her part of this great undertaking received the special commendation of Monsieur Villemain, who was the Minister of Public Instruction, and had she not belonged to the disenfranchised sex, she too would have been decorated with the Cross of the Legion of Honour. All the world has heard of the daring explorations of Baker and Livingstone in the Dark Continent, but how few are aware of the important part taken in their great enterprises by their devoted and heroic wives. Sir Samuel Baker immortalized himself by discovering Lake Albert Nyanza, one of the main sources of the Nile. But in attaining this goal, which other explorers in vain had essayed to reach, he was not alone. The companion of his triumph, as of his trials and hardships, was Lady Baker, a woman who, though delicately reared, was as brave in presence of danger as she was resourceful in trials and difficulties. More than once her husband owed his life to her intrepidity and presence of mind when confronted by the treacherous savages of equatorial Africa. And if he achieved success where others failed, it was in no slight measure due to her tact, her energy, and perseverance in what seemed at times a forlorn hope. She had learned Arabic with him in a year of necessary but wearisome delay. Her mind travelled with his mind as her feet had followed his footsteps. And when after the preliminary toils without number, after braving dangers from climate, disease, and ruthless savages, they finally stood on the shore of that unknown sea which was then first beheld by English eyes, she could, in contemplating their achievements, of which Albert Nyanza was the crowning glory, exclaim with exultation and truth, Quorum pars magna fui. When Livingstone lost, in the unexplored valley of the Zambezi, the faithful wife who had been his inspiring companion in his wanderings in darkest Africa, he lost completely that enthusiasm for deeds of high enterprise that had before been one of his leading characteristics. Writing to his distinguished friend, Sir Roderick Murchison, he mournfully declares, "I must confess this heavy stroke quite takes the heart out of me. Everything that has happened only made me more determined to overcome all difficulties, but after this sad stroke I feel crushed and void of strength. I shall do my duty still, but it is with a darkened horizon that I again set about it." The noted English naturalist, Frank Buckland, in speaking of the aid afforded by his gifted mother to her distinguished husband, Dr. Buckland, writes as follows: "During the long period that Dr. Buckland was engaged in writing the book which I now have the honour of editing, my mother sat up night after night for weeks and months consecutively, writing to my father's dictation, and this often until the sun's rays, shining through the shutters at early morn, warned the husband to cease from thinking, and the wife to rest her weary head." Not only with the pen did she render material assistance, but her natural talent in the use of her pencil enabled her to give accurate illustrations and finished drawings, many of which are perpetuated in Dr. Buckland's works. She was also particularly clever and neat in mending broken fossils. There are many specimens in the Oxford Museum now exhibiting their natural forms and beauty, which were restored by her perseverance to shape from a mass of broken and almost comminuted fragments. It was her occupation also to label the specimens, which she did in a particularly neat way, and there is hardly a fossil or a bone in the Oxford Museum which has not her handwriting upon it. Notwithstanding her devotion to her husband's pursuits, she did not neglect the education of her children, but occupied her mornings in superintending their instruction in sound and useful knowledge. The sterling value of her labours they now, in after life, fully appreciate, and feel most thankful that they were blessed with so good a mother. What has been said of the influence and co-operation of the women already named may with equal truth be affirmed of numberless others of recent as well as of earlier date. It is particularly true of the wife of the naturalist Heller and of the great astronomer Kepler. It is true of the wife of the illustrious mathematician, the Marquis de l'Hôpital. She not only shared her husband's talent for mathematics, but was of special assistance to him in preparing for the press his important Analyse de Infiniment Petit. It is true of the wife of Sappho, the illustrious discoverer of the satellites of Mars. Often he was on the point of abandoning the quest of these diminutive moons, which no one else had ever seen, but which his calculations led him to believe really existed. But he was encouraged by Mrs. Hall to continue his observations, with the result that his labours and vigils were at last rewarded by the startling discovery of Deimos and Phobos. And there is Madame Pasteur, who in her way was quite as important a factor in the scientific career of her immortal husband as were the women just mentioned in the lives of their husbands, to whose triumph they so materially contributed. One of the great Frenchman's biographers has truly declared that it is impossible rightly to appreciate Pasteur's life without some understanding of the immense assistance which he received in his home. Whether in discussing forms of crystals, watching over experiments, shielding her husband from all the daily fret of life, or busy at the customary evening task of writing to his dictation, Madame Pasteur was at once his most devoted assistant and incomparable companion. His surroundings at home were entirely subordinated to his scientific life, and his family shared with him both his trials and his triumphs. At the time when Pasteur was engrossed in the study of anthrax, and after many difficulties and disappointments had at length succeeded in preparing a vaccine against it, he at once hurried from the laboratory to communicate his great discovery first to his wife and daughter. It was particularly during his long and arduous researches on the disease of silkworms that Pasteur found his wife's aid of incalculable value. For Madame Pasteur and her daughter then constituted themselves veritable silkworm rearers. They collected mulberry leaves, sorted larvae, and were unremitting in their labours during the continuance of this memorable investigation. And not only in the silk-producing districts of southern France were they thus occupied, but also in a special laboratory in École Normale after their return to Paris. And when in the midst of these researches, on the successful outcome of which hinged one of the greatest sources of national wealth, the indefatigable savant was stricken with paralysis, and his life was for a while despaired of, it was again his devoted helpmate that afforded him solace in suffering, and exercised a supervision over those experiments which the great man was still conducting almost in the presence of death. That Pasteur's life was prolonged for a quarter of a century after the terrible attack of hemiplegia in 1868, that he was able to unravel the deep mysteries of microbian life, that he was able to make discoveries whose economic value to France was, in the estimation of Professor Huxley, more than sufficient to liquidate the immense indemnity of 5 billion francs exacted from his country by Germany at the termination of the Franco-Prussian War, that he was able, especially during these fruitful 25 years, to render his scientific life like a luminous trail in the great night of the infinitely little in those ultimate abysses of being where life is born, was in great measure due to the unceasing care, the untiring vigilance, and the sympathetic collaboration of one of the most devoted of wives and the most noble and whole-souled of women. What has been said of the influence and helpfulness of Madame Pasteur can be asserted with even greater truth of Elizabeth Agassiz and of Caroline Herschel. For these two women, apart from the assistance they gave to a loved husband and an idolized brother, in the labours that made them so famous, both achieved distinction for their contributions to the sciences which they individually cultivated with such splendid results. And had they elected to devote all their time to scientific research, instead of giving the greater part of it to those to whom they were so devotedly attached, who can tell how much more brilliant they would have been in their achievements, and how much greater would have been the fame they would have won for themselves? Both of them were dowered in an eminent degree with taste and talent for science, and had they chosen to make it the sole object of their life work, there can be no doubt that their personal contributions to natural history and astronomy would have been far greater than they were. As it was, they were so overshadowed by those for whom they laboured with such unselfishness and loyalty that the real value of their work is too often forgotten when there is a question of the scientific triumphs of Louise Agassiz and Sir William Herschel. But they willed it so. They gladly effaced themselves that those whom they loved with such a deep and abiding love might shine the more brightly in the firmament of science. They preferred to spend and be spent in strengthening the great workers and leaders with whose lives their own were so thoroughly identified, inspiring them with courage, keeping faith in their own ideas alive in the days of darkness when all the world seems adverse to desert. Both of these noble women had the same quality in common: absolute devotion and unswerving faith in those to whose success and happiness they had dedicated their lives. They sought nothing for themselves, they thought nothing of themselves. They both had, to borrow the idea of another, an intense power of sympathy, a generous love of giving themselves in the service of others, which enabled them to transfuse the force of their own personality into the objects to which they dedicated their powers. In the preface of the joint work of Mr. and Mrs. Agassiz, entitled A Journey in Brazil, that delightful volume which throws such a flood of light on the flora and fauna of the Amazon Valley, occur the following significant words regarding the share each had in producing the book. Our separate contributions have become so closely interwoven that we should hardly know how to disconnect them. So was it with all their undertakings. There was the same common interest, the same unity of purpose, the same unselfish devotion to the cause of science during these long years of toil which were so prolific in results of supreme importance. Reading between the lines in A Journey in Brazil and in Louis Agassiz, His Life and Correspondence, written by Mrs. Agassiz, we can easily fancy that the great naturalist owed as much, if not more, to his wife's never-failing sympathy and inspiration as to her active co-operation in his work. And we are ready to apply to her the words of Longfellow when he sings, "And whenever the way seemed long, or his heart began to fail, she would sing a more wonderful song, or tell a more wonderful tale." As to Caroline Herschel as a helper and sustainer of her illustrious brother, too much cannot be said. In the days when he gave up a lucrative career that he might devote himself to astronomy, it was owing to her thrift and care that he was not harassed by the rankling vexations of money matters. She had been his helper and assistant when he was a leading musician. She became his helper and assistant when he gave himself up to astronomy. By sheer force of will and devoted affection she learned enough of mathematics and of methods of calculation, which to these unlearned seem mysteries, to be able to commit to writing his researches. She became his assistant in the workshop. She helped him to grind and polish his mirrors. She stood beside his telescope in the nights of midwinter to write down his observations when the very ink was frozen in the bottle. She kept him alive by her care, thinking nothing of herself, she lived for him. She loved him and believed in him, and helped him with all her heart and with all her strength. She might have become a distinguished woman on her own account, for with the 7-foot Newtonian sweeper given her by her brother she discovered 8 comets first and last. But the pleasure of seeking and finding for herself was scarcely tested. She minded the heavens for her brother. She worked for him, not for herself, and the unconscious self-denial with which she gave up her own pleasure in the use of her sweeper is not the least beautiful picture in her life. While recounting the achievements of women who directly or indirectly contributed to our knowledge of the earth and what it contains, we cannot forget what the world owes to the gracious and glorious Isabella of Castile. For it is to her probably as much as to Columbus that a new continent was discovered at the close of the 15th century. For while the doctors of Salamanca, most of whom were what Galileo called paper philosophers, men who fancied that a correct knowledge of the physical universe was to be obtained by a collation of ancient texts, were denouncing the great navigator as an idle dreamer, and quoting the ill-founded notions of Pliny and Aristotle to prove the impossibility of his carrying out his project, Isabella was quietly revolving in her own mind the reasons which Columbus had adduced in favour of his great enterprise. Having satisfied herself that his views were sufficiently probable to justify action, she was prepared to make any sacrifices to have his plans executed. The result of her decision is but another illustration of the value of women's quick intuition as against the slow reasoning processes of philosophers and men of science. Again, while considering what women have accomplished for the advancement of science by inspiration and collaboration, we must not lose sight of what they have done by suggestion. For as John Stuart Mill well observes, it no doubt often happens that a person who has not widely and accurately studied the thoughts of others on a subject has by natural sagacity a happy intuition which he can suggest but cannot prove, which yet when matured may be an important addition to knowledge. But even then no justice can be done to it until some other person who does possess the previous acquirements takes it in hand, tests it, gives it a scientific or practical form, and fits it into its place among the existing truths of philosophy or science. Is it supposed that such felicitous thoughts do not occur to women? They occur by hundreds to every woman of intellect, but they are mostly lost for want of a husband or friend who has the other knowledge which can enable him to estimate them properly and bring them before the world. And even when they are brought before it, they usually appear as his ideas, not their real authors. Who can tell how many of the original thoughts put forth by male writers belong to a woman by suggestion, to themselves only by verifying and working out? If I may judge by my own case, a very large proportion indeed. Footnote. The idea herein expressed is beautifully accentuated in the touching dedication to the author's work On Liberty, which reads as follows: To the beloved and deplored memory of her who was the inspirer, and in part the author of all that is best in my writings, the friend and wife whose exalted sense of truth and right was my strongest incitement, and whose approbation was my chief reward, I dedicate this volume. Like all that I have written for many years, it belongs as much to her as to me, but the work as it stands has had, in a very insufficient degree, the inestimable advantage of her revision, and some of the most important portions having been reserved for a more careful re-examination, which they are now never destined to receive. Were I but capable of interpreting into the world one half of the great thoughts and noble feelings which are buried in her grave, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write, unprompted and unassisted by her all but unrivalled wisdom. The chivalrous sentiments expressed in this generous tribute by one of the deepest thinkers of his time to the memory of his noble and gifted life companion, extravagant as they may seem, are but echoes of a similar sentiment often voiced before by the world's greatest leaders of thought and science. Nor should we forget those active and energetic women, and their number is much greater than is ordinarily supposed, whose husbands, although often endowed with genius of the highest order, were indolent by temperament and disorderly and unmethodical by nature. Such men would, in the majority of cases, have run to seed had not their genius been given special force and impulse by their vigorous and methodical helpmates. Sir William Hamilton, the most learned philosopher of the Scottish school, is a striking instance in point, for it was due almost entirely to the stimulation he received from his ever-active wife that he was always kept keyed up to the fullest working capacity as a philosopher, and became recognized the world over as one of the commanding intellects of his age. Lady Hamilton, writes Professor Veitch in his memoir of Sir William Hamilton, had a power of keeping her husband up to what he had to do. She contended wisely against a sort of energetic indolence which characterized him, and which, while he was always labouring, made him apt to put aside the task actually before him, sometimes diverted by subjects of inquiry suggested in the course of study on the matter at hand, sometimes discouraged by the difficulty of reducing to order the immense mass of materials he had accumulated in connection with it. Then her resolution and cheerful disposition sustained and refreshed him, and never more so than when during the last 12 years of his life his bodily strength was broken, and his spirit, though languid, yet ceased not from mental toil. The truth is that Sir William's marriage, his comparatively limited circumstances, and the character of his wife, supplied to a nature that would have been contented to spend its mighty energies in work that brought no reward but in the doing of it, and that might never have been made publicly known or available, the practical force and impulse which enabled him to accomplish what he actually did in literature and philosophy. It was this influence, without doubt, which saved him from utter absorption in his world of rare, noble, and elevated, but ever increasingly unattainable ideas. But for it, the serene sea of abstract thought might have held him becalmed for life, and in the absence of all utterance of definite knowledge of his conclusions, the world might have been left to an ignorant and mysterious wonder about the unprofitable scholar. It is frequently said that women, unlike men, are indifferent to fame. This may be true so far as they are personally concerned, but it is certainly not true of them in regard to their husbands or the men for whom they have a genuine affection. This is abundantly proved by the lives of Madame Huber, Madame Pasteur, Caroline Herschel, and Lady Hamilton, not to mention others who have been named in the foregoing pages. After Sir William Hamilton, at the age of 56, had been stricken by hemiplegia on the right side as a result of overwork, his faithful wife became for 12 years hands, eyes, and even mind for him. She read and consulted books for him, and helped him to prepare his lectures and the works which have given him such celebrity. Everything that was sent to the press and all the courses of lectures were written by her, either to dictation or from copy. And when we remember that the lectures and books were of the most abstruse character, and that Lady Hamilton was associated with her husband in his recondite work throughout his long and brilliant career, we must confess that her conduct was not only heroic to a degree, but also that the fame of the one she loved was to her a matter of deepest concern. What has been so far said, important as it is, does not tell the whole story of woman's influence on men of science, and consequently on the progress of science. We should not have an adequate conception of women as inspirers and collaborators if we did not advert to certain faculties which they usually possess in a more eminent degree than the most of men. It is a well-known fact that in many of the affairs of life women are more practical, have more tact, and possess keener and quicker perceptions than men. They are, too, more ideal, more romantic, and more enthusiastic. Men of science in their investigations usually proceed by the slow and laborious process of collecting facts and collating phenomena, either by observation or experiment or both, and from the observed facts and phenomena they formulate a law which explains and correlates them. This is known as induction, a method which proceeds from facts to ideas. Women, on the contrary, are rather disposed to proceed from ideas to facts, to explain phenomena from ideas which already exist in the mind, without having recourse to the slow process of induction. This is the deductive method, and is the very reverse of that employed by the average man of science. It would, however, be a mistake to maintain that the inductive method is always employed, for such is not the case. More than half a century ago, the historian Buckle, in a notable lecture delivered in the Royal Institution of Great Britain, directed attention to the fact that some of the greatest scientific discoveries had been made by the deductive method. One of these was Newton's epoch-making discovery of universal gravitation. While sitting in a garden he saw an apple fall, and this simple fact caused him to advance from idea to idea, and to be carried by what Tyndall loved to call the scientific use of the imagination, into the distant realms of space. And heedless of the operations of nature, neither observing nor experimenting, the great philosopher, by pure a priori reasoning, completed the most sublime and majestic speculation that it ever entered into the heart of man to conceive. It was, as Buckle well observes, the triumph of an idea. It was the audacity of genius. It was also the triumph of the deductive method in the solution of a problem that no one not a genius could have worked out, only by the long and toilsome process of induction. Similarly, the great law of metamorphosis in plants, according to which the stamens, pistils, corollas, bracts, petals, and so forth, of every plant are simply modified leaves, was discovered not by an inductive investigator, but by a poet. Guided by his brilliant imagination, his passion for beauty, and his exquisite conception of form which supplied him with ideas, Germany's greatest poet, Goethe, by reasoning deductively, was able to generalize a law which lesser minds could never have arrived at except through the application of the inductive method. So also was it in the science of crystallography. Its foundations were laid not by a mineralogist nor a mathematician, as one would suppose, but by one of strong imagination and marked poetic temperament. Like Goethe, Huey was led by his ideas of beauty and symmetry to work deductively on the problem before him. Descending from ideas to facts, he finally succeeded, after a long series of subsequent labours, in reading the riddle which had baffled his able but unimaginative predecessors. It is the possession of this deductive faculty so characteristic of men of genius, their ability to reach conclusions directly, as great mathematicians perceive inferences which those less gifted reach only after pages of elaborate calculations, which enable women not indeed to make scientific discoveries, but to exercise the most momentous and salutary influence over the method by which scientific discoveries are made. For, as Buckle points out, men of science are too inclined to employ the inductive method to the exclusion of the deductive. Footnote. Induction is indeed a mighty weapon laid up in the armoury of the human mind, and by its aid great deeds have been accomplished and noble conquests have been won. But in that armoury there is another weapon, I will not say of stronger make, but certainly of keener edge. And if that weapon had been oftener used during the present and preceding century, our knowledge would be far more advanced than it actually is. If the imagination had been more cultivated, if there had been a closer union between the spirit of poetry and the spirit of science, natural philosophy would have made greater progress, because natural philosophers would have taken a higher and more successful aim, and would have enlisted on their side a wider range of human sympathies. They have become slaves to the tyranny of facts, and as such are incompetent to further the progress of science as they would by using both methods instead of one. And their slavery would be still more complete and ignominious were it not for the great though unconscious service to science rendered by women who have kept alive the deductive habit of thought. Their turn of thought, their habits of mind, their conversation, their influence, insensibly extending over the whole surface of society, and frequently penetrating its intimate structure, have, more than all other things put together, tended to raise us up into an ideal world, lift us from the dust in which we are too prone to grovel, and develop in us those germs of imagination which even the most sluggish and apathetic understandings in some degree possess. From the foregoing observations it is manifest that the best results to science are secured when men and women work together, men supplying the slow, logical reasoning power, women the vivid, far-reaching imagination. Men generalizing from facts, women from ideas, men working chiefly by induction, women principally by deduction. For thus collaborating, each with his or her predominant faculties, the two combined possess in a measure the elements which go to make up a man or woman of genius, and which enable them to achieve far more for the advancement of science than would otherwise be possible. No one has ever given a more eloquent expression to this truth than John Stuart Mill, who was as keen as an observer as he was profound as a thinker. Writing on the subject under discussion, he does not hesitate to say, "Hardly anything can be of greater value to a man of theory and speculation who employs himself, not in collecting materials of knowledge by observation, but in working them up by processes of thought into comprehensive truths of science and laws of conduct, than to carry on his speculations in the companionship and under the criticism of a really superior woman. There is nothing comparable to it for keeping his thoughts within the limits of real things and the actual facts of nature. A woman seldom runs wild after an abstraction. Women's thoughts are thus as useful in giving reality to those of thinking men as men's thoughts in giving width and largeness to those of women. In depth, as distinguished from breadth, I greatly doubt if even now women compared with men are at any disadvantage." We have already learned from his own avowal how much Mill was beholden to his wife for her active cooperation in the production of those works of his which have exerted so profound an influence on many phases of modern thought. A more striking illustration of the value of woman's assistance, but in the domain of biology, is found in the biography of the late Professor Huxley. By those who know this distinguished man of science, so remarkable for his intellectual vigour, only from his writings, the impression would be gleaned that he was one of the most independent thinkers, that his utterances on all subjects were absolutely personal and entirely unmodified by suggestion or criticism from any quarter. How far this view is from being correct is found in the statement by his son that his father invariably submitted his writings to the criticism of his wife before they were seen by any other eye. To her judgment was due the toning down of many a passage which erred by excess of vigour, and the clearing up of phrases which would be obscure to the public. In fact, if any essay met with her approval, he felt sure it would not fail of its effect when published. She was not only his help and stay for 40 years in his struggles ready to counsel in adversity to comfort, but over and above this she was the critic whose judgment he valued above almost any, and whose praise he cared most to win, the other self who made his life work possible. An intelligent, sympathetic pair of this kind, and this, as we have seen, is but one of a multitude which illuminates and beautifies the history of science, are competent to achieve wonders. They are like the two-celled heart beating with one full stroke, two plummets dropped for one to sound the abyss of science and the secrets of the mind. The woman is then truly, as de Lamennais in scriptural phrases has it, man's companion, man's assistant, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. and in her sublime and enduring character so complete in every relation of life, she fully answers to the beautiful characterization which Adam, in Paradise Lost, gives of his beloved Eve. So absolute she seems, and in herself complete, so well to know her own that what she wills to do or say seems wisest, virtuousest, discreetest, best. Authority and reason on her weight, and to consummate all, greatness of mind and nobleness their seat, build in her loveliest and creation awe about her as a guard angelic placed. End of chapter 11, part 2.
Section 25 of Woman in Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Woman in Science by John Augustine Zahm. Chapter 12, Part 1. The Future of Women in Science, Summary and Epilogue. Saint Evremond, the first great master of the genteel style in French literature, who was equally noted as a brilliant courtier, a graceful wit, a professed Epicurean, and who exerted so marked an influence on the writings of Voltaire and the essayists of Queen Anne's time, gives us in one of his desultory productions an entertaining disquisition on La femme qui ne se trouvait point et ne se trouvera jamais, the woman who is not and never will be found. The caption of this singular essay admirably expresses the idea that the majority of mankind has, even until the present day, held respecting woman in science. For them she was non-existent. Nature, in their view, had disqualified her for serious and, above all, for abstract science. Never, therefore, in the opinion of these solemn wiseacres, had been found or could be found a woman who had achieved distinction in science. The foregoing chapters show how ill-founded is such a view regarding woman in times past. For that half of humanity which has produced such scientific luminaries as Aspasia, Laura Brasi, Maria Gaetana Agnesi, Sophie Germain, Mary Somerville, Caroline Herschel, Sonia Kowaleski, Agnes S. Lewis, Margaret Dunlop Gibson, Eleanor Ormerod, and Madame Curie, to mention no others, is far from exhibiting any evidence of intellectual disqualification, and still farther from warranting anyone from declaring that the successful pursuit of science is entirely beyond the mental powers of womankind. The preceding pages, likewise, afford an answer to those who insist on woman's incapacity for scientific pursuits, and point to the small number of those that have attained eminence in any of the branches of science, who continue to assert that the women named are but exceptions to the rule of the hopeless inferiority of their sex, and that no conclusions can be deduced from the paucity of women who have risen above the intellectual level of their less fortunate or less highly dowered sisters. They further show that, until the last few decades, woman's environment was rarely, if ever, favorable to her pursuit of science. From the days of Aspasia until the latter half of the 19th century, she was discriminated against by law, custom, and public opinion. Save only in Italy, she was excluded from the universities and from learned societies in which she might have had an opportunity of developing her intellect. In other countries, her social ostracism in all that pertained to mental development was so complete and universal that she rarely had an opportunity of making a trial of her powers or exhibiting her innate capacity. The consequence was that her mind remained in a condition of comparative atrophy, a condition that gave rise to that long prevalent belief in woman's intellectual inferiority to man and her natural incapacity for everything that is not light or frivolous. Practically all that women have achieved in science, until very recent years, has been accomplished in defiance of that conventional code which compelled them to confine their activities to the ordinary duties of the household. The lives and achievements of the eminent mathematicians, Sophie Germain and Mary Somerville, are good illustrations of the truth of this assertion. It was only their persistence in the study of their favorite branch of science, in spite of the opposition of their family and friends, and in spite of what was considered taboo for their sex by the usages and ordinances of society, that they were able to attain that eminence in the most abstruse of the sciences, which won for them the plaudits of the world. Both were virtually self-made women, deprived of the advantages of a college or university education, and denied the stimulus afforded by membership in learned scientific associations. They nevertheless succeeded by their own unaided efforts in winning a place of highest honor in the Walhalla of men of science. Monsieur Alphonse de Candolle, in his great work, Histoire des Sciences et des Savants depuis deux siècles, devotes only 2 pages to the consideration of woman in science. She is to him a negligible quantity. And, although a professed man of science, he repeats, without any scientific warrant whatever, all the gratuitous statements of his predecessors regarding the superficial character of the female mind. A mind, he will have it, which, quote, takes pleasure in ideas that are readily seized by a kind of intuition, end quote, a mind, quote, to which the slow methods of observation and calculation by which truth is surely arrived at are not pleasing. Truths themselves, the Swiss savant continues, quote, independent of their nature and possible consequences, especially general truths which have no relation to a particular person, are of small moment to most women. Add to this a feeble independence of opinion, a reasoning faculty less intense than in man, and finally the horror of doubt, that is, a state of mind in which all research in the sciences of observation must begin and often end. These reasons are, according to de Candolle, more than sufficient to explain the position of women in scientific pursuits. End quote. They certainly are more than sufficient to explain their position if we choose to accept the author's method of determining one's attainments in the realm of science. His chief test of one's eminence in science is the number of learned societies to which one belongs. For de Candolle, membership in one or more such bodies is prima facie evidence of special distinction in some branch of science. But we, he declares, quote, do not see the name of any women on the lists of learned men connected with the principal academies. This is not due entirely to the fact that the customs and regulations have made no provision for their admission, for it is easy to assure oneself that no person of the feminine sex has ever produced an original scientific work which has made its mark in any science, and commended the attention of specialists in science. I do not think it has ever been considered desirable to elect a woman a member of any of the great scientific academies with restricted membership. End quote. When de Candolle insisted on membership in learned societies as a necessary indication of scientific eminence, he must have known what everybody knew, that such exclusive societies as the French Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society of Great Britain have always been dead set against the admission of women members. It is difficult to imagine that the learned author of the History of Science and Scientists was entirely ignorant of the exclusion from the French Academy of Maria Gaetana Agnesi solely because she was a woman. And he must have been aware that, had it not been for her sex, Sophie Germain would have been accorded a fauteuil in the same society for her remarkable investigations in one of the difficult departments of mathematical physics. He must likewise have been cognizant of the attitude of such organizations as the Royal Society toward women, no matter how meritorious their achievements in science. According to de Candolle's criterion, such women as Madame Curie, Sonia Kovalevsky, Eleanor Omerod, Agnes S. Lewis, Margaret Dunlop Gibson, have accomplished nothing worthy of note because, forsooth, their names are not found on the rolls of membership of the Royal Society or the French Academy of Sciences, associations whose constitutions have been purposely so framed as to exclude women from membership. It would indeed be difficult to instance a more unfair or a more unscientific test of women's eminence in science, and that, too, proposed by one who is supposed to be actuated in his judgments by rigorously scientific methods. Had any of the women named belonged to the male sex, there never would have been any question of their fitness to become members of the societies in question. This is particularly true of Madame Curie, who, in the estimation of the world, has done more to enhance the prestige of French science than any man of the present generation, a statement that is sufficiently justified by the fact that she is the only one so far who has twice, in competition with the greatest of the world's men of science, succeeded in carrying away the great Nobel Prize. Footnote. A writer in the English magazine Nature, under date of January 12, 1911, when the European press was discussing Madame Curie's claims to membership in the French Academy of Sciences, makes the following sane observations on the admission of women to the various academies of the French Institute. Quote, "There may be room for difference of opinion as to the wisdom or expediency of permitting women to embark on the troubled sea of politics, or of allowing them a determinate voice in the settlement of questions which may affect the existence or the destiny of a nation. But surely there ought to be no question that in the peaceful walks of art, literature, and science, there should be the freest possible scope extended to them, and that, as human beings, every avenue to distinction and success should unreservedly be open to them. All academies tend to be conservative and to move slowly. They are the homes of privilege and of vested interest. Some of them incline to be reactionary. They were created by men for men, and for the most part at a time when women played little or no part in those occupations which such societies were intended to foster and develop. But the times have changed. Women have gradually won for themselves their rightful position as human beings. We have now to recognize that academies, as seats of learning, were made for humanity, and that, as members of the human race, women have the right to look upon their heritage and property no less than men. This consummation may not at once be reached, but, as it is based upon reason and justice, it is certain to be attained eventually." End quote. A fortnight later, the same magazine contained a second article in which the matter is treated in an equally manly fashion. Quote, "As scientific work," the writer pertinently observes, "must ultimately be judged by its merits, and not by the nationality or sex of its author, we believe that the opposition to the election of women into scientific societies will soon be seen to be unjust and detrimental to the progress of natural knowledge. By no pedantic reasoning can the rejection of a candidate for membership of a scientific society be justified if the work done places the candidate in the leading position among other competitors. Science knows no nationality, and should recognize no distinction of sex, color, or creed among those who are contributing to its advancement. Believing that this is the conclusion to which consideration of the question must inevitably lead, we have confidence that the doors of all scientific societies will eventually be open to women on equal terms with men." End quote. End footnote. Not only have men, from time immemorial, been wont to point to woman's incapacity for science as evidenced by the small number of those who have achieved distinction in any way of its branches, but they have also taken a special pleasure in directing attention to the fact that no woman has ever given to the world any of the great creations of genius, or been the prime mover in any of the far-reaching discoveries which have so greatly contributed to the weal, the advancement, and the happiness of our race. No one probably has expressed himself on this subject in a more positive or characteristic fashion than the noted literateur and philosopher, Count Joseph de Maistre. Writing from St. Petersburg to his daughter Constance, he says, quote, "Voltaire, according to what you affirm, for as to me I know nothing, as I have not read all his works, and have not read a line of them during the last 30 years, says that women are capable of doing all that men do, etc. This is merely a compliment paid to some pretty woman, or rather, it is one of the 100,000 and thousand silly things which he said during his lifetime. The very contrary is the truth. Women have produced no chef d'oeuvre of any kind whatsoever. They have been the authors neither of the Iliad, nor the Aeneid, nor the Jerusalem Delivered, nor Phaedre, nor Atalier, nor Rhodogun, nor the Misanthrope, nor Tartuffe, nor the Jour, nor the Pantheon, nor the Church of St. Peter's, nor the Venus de Medici, nor the Apollo Belvedere, nor the Principia, nor the Discourse on Universal History, nor Telemachus. They have invented neither algebra, nor the telescope, nor achromatic glasses, nor the fire engine, nor hose machines, etc." Footnote. It was this same brusque and original writer who asserted that, "Science was a most dangerous thing for women, that no woman should study science under penalty of becoming ridiculous and unhappy, that a coquette can more readily get married than a savant." And he it was who declared that women who attempted to emulate men in the pursuit of science are monkeys and donne barbute, bearded women, and who designated Madame de Staël as la science en jupon, una impertinente femmelette. Science in petticoats, a silly, impertinent female. He, however, met an opponent worthy of his steel in the person of the eloquent Bishop of Orleans, Monseigneur Dupanloup. In a lengthy and brilliant critique of de Maistre's views, he shows them to be untenable if not ridiculous. "I by no means," he writes, "agree with Monsieur de Maistre that la science en jupon, as he calls it, or talents of any kind whatsoever, militates in the slightest against a woman being a good wife or a good mother. Quite the contrary." And considering women as the companion and aid of man, socia et adjutorium, he expresses a view which is quite the opposite of that championed by his distinguished adversary, for, in words precise and pregnant, he asserts that the education of women cannot be too consistent, too serious, and too solid. All this is true, but what does it prove? It does not prove, as is so frequently assumed, woman's lesser brain power or inferior intelligence. It does not prove, as the learned Frenchman and those who are similarly minded would have us believe, her incapacity for the highest flights of genius in every sphere of intellectual effort. Such assumptions are entirely negatived by woman's past achievements in all departments of art, literature, and science. Far from making the inference that de Maistre wished his daughter to draw from his letter, we should, from what we know of woman's ability as disclosed in the foregoing chapters, hesitate to set a limit to her powers, or to declare apodictically that she could not have been the author of works of as great merit as most of those, if not all of them, mentioned as among men's supreme achievements. The simple fact that Madame Curie and Sonia Kovalevsky were able, in sciences usually considered beyond female intelligence, to wrest from their male competitors the most coveted prizes within the gift of the Nobel Prize Commission and the French Academy of Sciences, demonstrates completely that woman's assumed capacity for even the most recondite scientific pursuits is a mere figment of the masculine imagination. "What women have done, that at least, if nothing else," as John Stuart Mill aptly observes, "it is proved they can do." When we consider how sedulously they are all trained away from, instead of being trained toward, any of the occupations or objects reserved for men, it is evident that I am taking very humble ground for them when I rest their case on what they have actually achieved. For, in this case, negative evidence is worth while any positive evidence is conclusive. It cannot be inferred to be impossible that a woman should be a Homer, or an Aristotle, or a Michelangelo, or a Beethoven, because no woman has yet actually produced works comparable to theirs in any of those lines of excellence. This negative fact at most leaves the question uncertain, and open to psychological discussion. But it is quite certain that a woman can be a Queen Elizabeth, or a Deborah, or a Joan of Arc, since this is not inference, but a fact." In like manner, it is quite certain that, in spite of all kinds of disabilities and prejudices and adverse legislation, there have been a large number of women who, in every department of intellectual activity, have achieved marked distinction and won imperishable renown for their proscribed sex. It is a fact which admits of no question that, notwithstanding their being debarred from all the educational advantages so generously lavished upon the dominant sex, women have, since the days of Sappho and Hypatia, shown themselves the equals and often the superiors of men in the highest and noblest spheres of mental achievement. Such being the case, what, we may ask, would have been the result had women, from that splendid heroic period of which Homer sings until the present, enjoyed all the opportunities of mental development of which men have systematically claimed the exclusive privilege? Footnote. The late Mr. Gladstone asserts that, quote, "It would be hard to discover any period of history or country of the world, not being Christian, in which they, women, stood so high as with the Greeks of the heroic age," end quote, when the position of the Greek woman was so remarkable and, quote, "so elevated, both absolutely and in comparison with what it became in the historic ages of Greece and Rome amidst their elaborate civilization," end quote. End footnote. What would now be their condition if, from the days of the Muses, who were but learned women apotheosized, women had never been deprived of their intellectual birthright and had been permitted to continue in the path so auspiciously blazed by Corinna, the victor over Pindar, and Arete, the splendor of Greece and the possessor of the mind of Socrates and the tongue of Homer? What would not now be their intellectual efflorescence if Plato's dream of 23 centuries ago of giving women equal rights with men in all things of the mind could have been realized? If those ardent female disciples of his, who so lovingly followed him through the streets of Athens, the home of the intellectual and the beautiful, and hung on his lips during his matchless discourses in the groves of the Academy and on the banks of the Ilissus, could have continued that race of intellect and genius which was the admiration and the inspiration of all Hellas during the most brilliant period of its marvelous history. Speculating only on what the gifted daughters of Greece might have achieved, we may easily believe that they would have kept pace with their most highly gifted countrymen, and that, following in the footsteps of Sappho and the other muses of the terrestrial nine, they would have been worthy rivals of Homer, Pindar, and Aeschylus, and would have occupied a prominent place in that brilliant galaxy of genius composed of such luminaries as Anaxagoras, Sophocles, Euclid, Archimedes, Theophrastus, Polygnotus, Diophantus, Pausanias, and Thucydides. To those who base their opinions on what so long has been the absurdly anomalous condition of women, and who, in formulating their theories of human progress, completely ignore the fundamental laws of heredity, such conjectures will seem extravagant, if not chimerical. But, when one bears in mind the universal fact that offspring, whatever the sex, inherits its characteristics and its powers from both parents alike, that the soul, unlike the body, has no sex, and that so far as legitimate indications from the teachings of biology and psychology can serve as a guide, there is no valid reason for asserting the mental superiority of man over woman, one will be obliged to confess that these surmises are far from being either fanciful or preposterous. It is then the veriest sophism to predicate women's incapacity for science and for intellectual achievements of the highest order on what she has not accomplished in the past, or on the comparatively limited number of her contributions to the advancement of knowledge. For up till the present she has, for the most part, been but a dwarf of the gynecium, cramped under worse than South Sea Isle taboo. Had men been compelled to labor under similar conditions, it is doubtful if they would have accomplished any more than women have now to their credit. Considering women's past achievements in science, as well as in other departments of knowledge, considering her present opportunities for developing her long-hampered faculties, and considering especially the many new social and economic adjustments which have been made within the last half-century, in consequence of the greatly changed conditions of modern life, it requires no prophetic vision to forecast what share the gentler sex will have in the future advancement of science. That it will be far greater than it has been hitherto, there can be no reasonable doubt. That the number of savants of the type of Maria Gaetana Agnesi, Sonia Kovalevsky, and Madame Curie will be greatly enlarged, there is every reason to believe. that among these coming votaries of science there will be more than one woman who, even in the most abstruse sciences, will stand, "upon an even pedestal with man," seems to be assured by the achievements of many who are now so materially adding to the sum of human knowledge. Is it probable that the future will bring forth women whose achievements in science will rank with those of Euler, Faraday, Liebig, Leverrier, Champollion, and Geoffroy St. Hilaire? It would be a rash man who would answer in the negative. We cannot, as de Maistre seems to do, reason from what they have not done, when everything was against them, to what they may do when conditions shall, in every way, be as favorable to them as they always have been to the dominant sex. Still rasher would be the man who would attempt to prove the negative of this question. Mere a priori arguments, based on preconceived bias or on the vague and groundless impression that woman is essentially and hopelessly the intellectual inferior of man, have no more value than gratuitous opinions. The unprejudiced seeker after truth will insist on a demonstration based on incontrovertible facts. He will appeal to history to learn what the sex has already accomplished, and to science to inquire if there be anything in the female brain to differentiate it from that of the male, or to preclude woman from attaining the highest rank in the activities of the intellect. The result of such an investigation will, I think, cause even the most biased person to suspend judgment, if it does not induce him to align himself with those who, finding no differences in the mental endowments of the sexes, have reached the conclusion that the day will come, and mayhap in the near future, when the achievements of woman will be on a par with those of man. The facts stated in the preceding chapters seem, not unreasonably, to point to such a conclusion, if indeed they do not warrant it as a necessary inference. A few considerations germane to this discussion will illustrate the danger of forming hasty judgments regarding questions like the one under discussion. During the last 100 years, no country in the world has done more for the education of the masses than the United States. Everything that money could purchase and ingenuity suggest has been adopted to develop the minds and stimulate the latent talents and genius of our youth. From the primary schools to the highest and best equipped universities, a special premium has been put on success in study, and the highest rewards have awaited those who should make any notable contribution towards the advancement of knowledge. But, notwithstanding all the educational advantages our people have enjoyed, and all the encouragement they have received to achieve something of supreme excellence, our great country, with its teeming millions, attracted from the most gifted nations of the Old World, has not yet produced a single man who has attained the highest rank in either literature or art or science. Far from having a preeminent master of song like Homer or Dante, we have not even a poet approaching Goethe, or Tasso, or Camoens. We have no Cervantes, no Milton, no Racine, no Molière. America has produced no Raphael or Michelangelo, no Mozart or Wagner or Tchaikovsky. Nor has it given us a Descartes, a Leibniz, a Newton, or a Darwin. Would anyone, from this complete absence in America of representatives of the highest order in literature, art, and science, ever dream of concluding that we shall never have such favorite sons of genius and such sons of intellect? Does our comparative intellectual sterility in the past, and in a country which seemed especially adapted to foster genius and attainments of the highest order, justify anyone in inferring that the days of great geniuses, like the days of demigods, are gone never to return? And yet the number of men in our broad commonwealth who, during the past 100 years, have enjoyed such signal opportunities for attaining distinction in every domain of intellectual effort is incomparably greater than that of all the women so favored since the earliest days of human history. If, from the first flowering of Greek culture to the present day, as many millions of women had enjoyed all the transcendent advantages of education as have been in the United States so lavishly accorded to the same number of millions of men, who will say that very many of them would not have attained a much higher rank in science, as well as in art and literature, than has yet been reached by any man that America has yet produced? Who even, on the evidence now available, would be warranted in denying that at least some of these millions of women might have attained the very highest rank in every department of intellectual achievement? Gray, in his Elegy Written on a Country Churchyard, muses on the potential statesmen and the "mute, inglorious Miltons" of those countless multitudes who, for lack of opportunity to develop their inborn gifts, were condemned to pass their lives in obscurity and die "to fortune and to fame unknown." But how much more truthfully could his words have been applied to that much larger number of women of rare mental powers, to whose eyes knowledge, "her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did ne'er unroll," and whose God-given genius was ruthlessly suppressed from the cradle to the grave? We are still in ignorance as to many of the conditions which are essential to the development of genius, and which contribute to its loftiest flights. We have yet to learn how far the efflorescence of the human mind is aided and modified by heredity, environment, atmosphere, as well as by education, encouragement, and other stimuli equally potent. But we do know that Germany, in spite of its famed universities and its feverish intellectual activity in many departments of knowledge, had to wait many long dreary centuries before it could point to a Goethe, a Schiller, a Humboldt, a Bach, or a Beethoven. We know that France, so long the reputed center of culture, has so far produced no great epic poet, no Cervantes, no Murillo. But shall we affirm that she will never give to the world imperishable works like Paradise Lost, Don Quixote, or the Immaculate Conception? We know that Athens, which during the most brilliant period of its history counted only 5,400 free-born citizens, less than the population of a small modern town, was able to produce, within a very brief epoch, more men of supreme distinction than all the rest of Europe from the age of Pericles until the dawn of the Renaissance. Hers is still the art of the world, the literature of the world, the philosophy of the world, the culture of the world. For 25 centuries, her canons of taste and beauty have guided poets, orators, artists, and her matchless productions have been the inspiration, as they have been the despair, of the greatest geniuses of our modern world. Had the women of Greece not been put under constraint just as they were beginning to exhibit the splendid results of their intellectual activities, had they been encouraged to develop to the utmost their richly dowered minds, as were the men, a far larger number of them, no doubt, would have been as successful in carrying off coveted prizes in the intellectual arena as was Corinna in her contests with Pindar, and they would, likewise, as we may easily conceive, have greatly added to the number of masterpieces of Greek intellect in science as well as in art and letters. But the opportunity for women to test their powers, which was so wantonly snatched from their sisters in the Hellenic world, seems again to be offered to their sex. This opportunity, as has been stated, is due chiefly to their persistence in claiming the same right as men to intellectual development, as well as to the countless proofs they have given that their demands are founded on reason and justice. What shall be the outcome of the new opportunity for woman to prove her capacity as compared with man's in things of the intellect remains to be seen. But, from indications she has during recent years given of her powers in every branch of scientific inquiry, there can be little doubt that it will be of such character as to place woman on a higher intellectual plane than she has yet occupied. In physical strength and in the rougher conflicts with the world, she will doubtless always remain the lesser man. But, once she feels in full possession of liberty, "to burgeon out of all within her," she will duly justify her advocates who throughout the centuries have been, "maintaining that with equal husbandry the woman were an equal to the man." End of chapter 12, part 1.
Section 26 of Woman in Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. Women in Science by John Augustine Zahm. Chapter 12, Part 2. Not the least of the contributing factors to women's intellectual growth, and especially to her future achievements in science, are the recent adjustments for women in social and economic conditions brought about chiefly by far-reaching changes in the industrial world. Even so late as the last half of the 19th century, the energies of women, when they were not engaged in the kitchen or the nursery, were spent on the domestic loom, spinning wheel, and the knitting needle. All the various processes, from carding the wool to making it into clothing for all the members of the family, were in the hands of the housewife. Foods and cereals, which do away with so much of the drudgery of the kitchen, were unknown. Electricity, which has proved to be such a remarkable aid in every modern home, was little more than a mysterious force that was utilized in the electric telegraph. Most of the domestic labor-saving machines were still in their infancy and possessed by but few people. Large fortunes were confined to only a favored few in our great metropolises. The mass of the people was preoccupied with the struggle for existence. But science, the spirit of invention, and the advent of the age of machinery have completely changed the conditions of life which obtained but a generation ago. They have not only opened up for women countless occupations that were undreamed of in their mother's time, but have also given to tens of thousands of them the necessary means and leisure to indulge their tastes for study and research, and enabled an ever-increasing number of them to realize their aspirations for achieving distinction in the divers departments of scientific research. As an instance of this marked change in the intellectual activity of women, we need only consider what an important part they now take in our present prodigious literary output, as compared with their share in similar work but a few decades ago. As authors, as writers and readers in the editorial rooms of our leading periodicals, as contributors to learned journals, and reviews dealing with every branch of science, even the most abstruse, they now occupy a conspicuous place and are doing work that is quite as creditable as that of men. And it is no longer necessary, in deference to public sentiment, for them to write under a pseudonym, for it is no longer considered unfeminine, as it was in the time of the Bronte sisters, for women to acknowledge themselves the authors of books or of articles in magazines. If they elect to devote their lives to literary or scientific work, they will not be deterred from so doing by what Mrs. Grundy may say, or by the fear that some feeble imitator of Molière may dub them as précieux ridicules. The value of their productions, like those of men, is gauged solely by merit, and not by any narrow-minded considerations of the author's sex. So also will it be in all other occupations where women choose to gain their livelihood by devoting themselves to scientific pursuits rather than to manual labor or to secretarial work in the counting-room. There are positions open for them in colleges, universities, and the government service where, as professors or experts in every branch of science, their talents have full liberty of action, and where they have the same opportunity of achieving distinction in their chosen life work as have their male colleagues. In Germany there are today 1 million more women than men. It is the same in England. In France the number of women who are widows or unmarried or divorcees, or mothers with full-grown children, aggregates no less than 4.5 million. A similar condition obtains in other parts of Europe. A large percentage of this number is without home ties, and, as the old fields of labor are no longer open to women, they are forced to find new ones. They naturally demand the privilege of exercising their talents in occupations which are more congenial to them. Many have no inclination for any of the avocations in the industrial or commercial world, but have a very decided inclination as well as talent for scientific pursuits. Hence the ever-increasing number of women who seek employment in chemical and biological laboratories, in museums and astronomical observatories, as well as aspire to professorships of science in schools and colleges. From this large number of votaries of science some are sure to achieve distinction in their calling, and to contribute materially to the advancement of knowledge. In the course of time the number of those, like Madame Curie, Madame Coudreau, Mary Kingsley, Sonia Kovalevsky, Eleanor Ormerod, Caroline Herschel, Zelia Nuttall, Harriet Boyd Hawes, Donna Ercilia Bovatio, Sophia Perez-Slawewa, to name only a few, who will become prominent as chemists, explorers, naturalists, mathematicians, entomologists, astronomers, archaeologists, biologists, will be vastly increased, for women will find a greater stimulus for such work and more numerous demands for their service in the constantly expanding sphere of scientific research. Many women will, doubtless, become specialists in some specific branch of science, particularly if they have a genuine love for it, or be fired by an ambition to achieve fame as discoverers. But it is not probable that they will ever specialize to the same extent as men do. For men, scientific work has to a large extent become a métier, and success, as in industry, depends on a division of labor. Hence it is that their field of investigation is daily becoming more and more circumscribed. This is observable in all the sciences, but especially in such all-embracing sciences as chemistry, biology, and archaeology. A man now does well if he master a single branch of any of these sciences, and is hailed as exceptionally fortunate if he succeed in making some notable discovery in his limited field of research. So great, indeed, has been the activity of scientific men in every department of science during the last half-century, and so thoroughly have they explored the most hidden recesses of nature, that it, at times, seems as if there were but little left to discover. A prominent scientist recently well expressed the difficulty in making any striking additions to our knowledge of nature by asserting that all great discoveries would hereafter be made in the 6th place of decimals. This statement is well illustrated by the delicate instruments that were required to isolate such rare elements as radium, polonium, helium, and neon, which occur only in infinitesimal quantities. While men of science will be forced to continue as specialists as long as the love of fame, to consider no other motives of research, continues to be a potent influence in their investigations, it is probable that women will have less love for the long and tedious processes involved in the more difficult kinds of specialization. They will, it seems likely, be more inclined to acquire general knowledge of the whole circle of the sciences, a knowledge that will enable them to take a comprehensive survey of nature. And it will be fortunate for themselves, as well as for the men who must perforce remain specialists, if they elect to do so. For nothing gives falser views of nature as a whole, nothing more unfits the mind for a proper apprehension of higher and more important truths, nothing more incapacitates one for the enjoyment of the masterpieces of literature or the sweeter amenities of life, than the narrow occupation of a specialist who sees nothing in the universe but electrons, microbes, and protozoa. But just at the critical moment, when men of science would rather discover a process than a law, when they are so preoccupied with the infinitely little that they lose sight of the cosmos as a whole, when their attention is so riveted on particular phenomena that they will no longer have aptitude for rising from effects to causes, when they cease to have any interest in general ideas and stray away from the guidance of the true philosophic spirit, when, like Plato's cavemen, they have so long groped in darkness that their powers of vision are impaired, then it is that woman, the herald of a brighter race, comes to the rescue and holds up to their astonished gaze the picture of an ideal world whose existence they had almost forgotten. For women, as a rule, love science for its own sake, and, unlike the specialists in question, they are, in its pursuit, rarely actuated by any selfish or mercenary interests, or by the hope of financial reward. Precise and never-ending observations with the microscope and spectroscope, which at best give them but a superficial knowledge of certain details of science, while it leaves them in ignorance of the greater and better part of it, do not appeal to them. They prefer general ideas to particular facts, and love to roam over the whole realm of science, rather than confine themselves to one of its isolated corners. Women, writes M. Etienne Lamy, the distinguished French academician, group themselves at the center of human knowledge, whereas men disperse themselves towards its outer boundaries. While men are always pushing analysis to its utmost limits, women are seeking a synthesis. While men are becoming more technical, women are becoming more intellectual. They are better placed to observe the correlations of the different sciences, and to subordinate them to the common and unique source of truth from which they all descend. We seem, indeed, to be approaching a time when women will become the conservers of general ideas. In the preceding chapter reference was made to the fact that women are naturally inclined to adopt the deductive method in their search for truth, when men would employ only the inductive method. This disposition of theirs to arrive at conclusions by a kind of intuition, coupled with their more pronounced idealism, is sure to react favorably on men, and prevent them from becoming so involved in mere facts and phenomena as to cause them to forget that it is as important to reason well as to observe well. that the fundamental principles of a true philosophy are quite as necessary for the eminent man of science as they are to the trustworthy historian or commanding statesman. From what has been said, it is clear that man's ideal of the woman of the future will be quite different from what it was but a little more than a century ago, when Dr. Johnson could say that any acquaintance with books among women was distinguished only to be censured. It will be quite different from the ideal woman, as portrayed by poets and novelists, for centuries past. For among the thousands of women painted by our leading writers of fiction, poets, and dramatists, there are few, if any, outside of those sketched by Tennyson in The Princess, who are distinguished for their learning or for their love in intellectual pursuits. Even Portia, Shakespeare's most learned woman, was according to her own confession but an unlessoned girl, unschooled, unpracticed. And the heroines of the novelist, far from being women who had a thirst for knowledge, or were eager to sound the abyss of science and the secrets of the mind, were those only whose chief attractions were physical graces and charms, affectionate natures, brilliant wit together with sweet laughs for bird notes and blue eyes for a heaven. Now, however, that women after ages of struggle are beginning to experience a sense of intellectual freedom before unknown, and to exult in the fact that knowledge is now no more a fountain sealed, now that they are, for the first time, beginning in every civilized nation to realize their age-long aspirations for unimpeded opportunity in all the activities of the intellect, now that they are no longer dismissed in shame to live no wiser than their mothers, household stuff, live chattels, laughing-stocks of time, we may expect soon to see a marked change in the character of the ideal woman, as depicted in literature and as desired by the intelligent portion of mankind. But woman's liberation from intellectual bondage and her freedom to devote herself to scientific pursuits mean for the future of humanity is difficult at present to adequately forecast. That it will contribute immensely to the betterment of social conditions and to the elevation of the masses of humanity there can be no doubt. Setting free the imprisoned energies of one half of our race means more than doubling mankind's capacity for advancement, for the failure to utilize woman's vast energies, pining for an outlet, acted as a drag on man's own potentialities, and thus retarded to an untold extent the world's advancement. In times past, as has aptly been said, an enormous part of the brain power of mankind has been spent or wasted in smiting the Philistine's hip and thigh. An enormous part of the brain power of womankind has been spent in cajoling Samson. It will mean that the women of the future will be more suitable companions for the rapidly increasing number of highly educated men of science, that having their intellects develop pari passu with those of men, they will be able to sympathize with the noblest aims of their husbands and assist them in their most important undertakings, as did the wives of Huber, Lavoisier, Pasteur, Huxley, Louis Agassiz, and others scarcely less renowned in the annals of science. It will mean that they will not only share in the joys and the sorrows of their life companions, but that they will also have a part in their thoughts, their studies, their labors, their achievements. For one should bear in mind that the first essential to a perfect union of hearts is a perfect harmony of minds. Where neither husband nor wife is educated, the virtues may suffice for companionship, but where the man is educated and the woman is ignorant, there are sooner or later estrangements, and the wife becomes little better than an old Japanese conception of her, a cook without pay, or a pasha's toy for an idle hour. Crisald in Molière's L'École des Femmes declares qu'il est assez ennuyeux que je crois devoir toute sa vie une bête avec soi. A briefer and truer statement of the evils of unequal intellectual mating was never penned. Men of intelligence are no longer, like Rousseau, satisfied with an ignorant domestic for a wife, and still less are they disposed with Schopenhauer to regard woman as an incurable Philistine, and as a mere intermediary between a child and a man. They have learned by sad experience that it is contrary both to justice and public policy to impose artificial restrictions on the acquisition of knowledge by women, or to close to the vigorous and capable representatives of their sex careers which are open to the weakest and most incompetent men. History has taught them that the fall of Greece and Rome was owing to the failure of these nations to make due provision for the mental development of women. And women know that it was because of the inability of the wives of the Athenians to enter into the thoughts of their highly educated husbands and to sympathize with their aims and appreciate their achievements that caused the men to leave them in their solitude and seek in the companionship of the heterae the intellectual atmosphere which was wanting in their own homes. They know, too, that the lack of knowledge in the wife and the absence of virtue in the heterae, which brought such disasters on the most learned and most cultured of nations, are still evils to be guarded against, and that one of the means over and above moral rule and revealed truth of safeguarding their own interests and preserving the sanctity of the home is to make themselves by knowledge and culture the intellectual equals of their consorts. They realize also that if they are to attain the highest measure of success as wives and mothers, a broad and thorough education, a knowledge of science, as well as familiarity with art and literature and the teachings of religion, is essential to them for their children's sake. It is said that the hands that rock the cradle rules the world, but how much truer is it that the domestic earth is the first of schools, and the best of lecture rooms, for here the heart will cooperate with the mind, the affections with the reasoning power. It is only when the mothers of this, the woman's century, shall dispute with men the primacy of erudition, when they shall prove their mastery of those newer sciences by which our age sets such great store, when they shall possess seraphic intellect and force to seize and throw the doubts of man, that their grown-up sons will have the same confidence in their intelligence as they now have in their hearts. Then only will mothers be properly equipped for developing the character of their children, for inspiring them with the love of the truth, the beautiful and the good, for stimulating their talents and aiding them to attain all the sublimities of knowledge, for assisting them in doubt and despondency and firing them with an ambition to strive for supreme excellence in all that makes for the nobility of manhood and the glory of womanhood, for making them, as Beatrice made Dante after he was renewed and purified in the waters of Unoi, fit to mount up to the stars, puro e disposto a salire alle stelle. The romantic idea of treating woman as a clinging vine, and thus eliminating half the energies of humanity, is rapidly disappearing and giving place to the idea that the strong are for the strong, the intellectually strong, that the evolution of the race will be complete only when men and women shall be associated in perfect unity of purpose, and shall, in fullest sympathy, collaborate for the attainment of the highest and the best. Then indeed will man's helpmate become to him and to his children more rich than the pearls of Ind, or gold of Ophir, and in her sex more wonderful and rare. Then will men and women for the first time fully supplement each other in their aspirations and endeavors and realize somewhat of that oneness of heart and mind which was so beautifully adumbrated in Plato's Androgen. Then will the world witness the return of another golden age, the golden age of science, the golden age of cultured, noble, perfect womanhood. Then to all who really think and love will be manifest the clearness and power of vision of England's great poet laureate, when in matchless numbers he sings, "The woman's cause is man's. They rise or sink together, dwarfed or godlike, bond or free. For woman is not undeveloped man, but diverse. Could we make her as the man, sweet love were slain. His dearest bond is this, not like to like, but like in difference. Yet in the long years liker must they grow. The man be more of woman, she of man. He gain in sweetness and in moral height, nor lose the wrestling thews that throw the world. She mental breadth, nor fail in childward care, nor lose the childlike in the larger mind, till at the last she set herself to man, like perfect music unto noble words. And as these twain, upon the skirts of time, sit side by side, full summed in all their powers, dispensing harvest, sowing the to be, self-reverent each, and reverencing each, distinct in individualities, but like each other even as those who love, then comes the statelier Eden back to men, then reign the world's great bridals chaste and calm, then springs the crowning race of humankind. May these things be. End of Woman in Science by John Augustine Zahm.